So Dr. Seuss was a pretty interesting guy. You might not know this, but his grandparents emigrated from Germany in the 19th century. They came over here to be brewers and to sort of find the American dream. And they did that. They established a large brewery. They got really, really famous. So they passed it down to a young Ted Geisel. He was just ready to take over the family business and enjoy a life of ease and relaxation and comfort. But alas, something happened in the early part of the 20th century called the Prohibition. And so the family lost its business. And he was trying to figure out what to do with his life because the family business was gone. He discovered that he just could not focus during college. He doodled in class constantly. In fact, if you go online, you can see some of the actual doodled images that he made in college, where he was supposed to be taking notes on physics, but he was drawing pictures of bears and things like that in the margins. He couldn't figure out exactly what he wanted to do at first. He started by making some propaganda cartoons for the U.S. military, which you can still view online. For a long time, they weren't available. Now they are. And at first, he didn't realize that poetry would be his thing. Why? Because in the mid-20th century, children's literature had reached a point where they felt that prose was the only way to ever go again. Nobody reads iambic pentameter anymore. This isn't the time of Shakespeare. Kids want to read prose. And so he forced himself to write a couple of books in prose. You might have heard of the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. And then he decided to go with his gut instinct, thank God. And he stuck with poetry. And he went on to use several different verse forms, but he pretty much stuck to the same formula from about the 1960s until his last book, which was Oh, the Place You Shall Go, which came out a few months before he passed away in 1991. So he's sort of experimenting with the styles that would make him famous later. This story is called Thidwick, the Big-Hearted Moose, or as my son Stephen Paul says, Thidwick. Up at Lake Winnebago, the far northern shore, lives a huge herd of moose, about 60 or more. And they all go around in a big happy bunch looking for nice tender moose moss to munch. Up at Lake Winnebago one day they were lunching, just strolling along and enjoying their munching, for the moose moss that day was particularly fine, when it happened that Thidwick, the last moose in line, saw a binglebug sitting. The bug called out, "Hey, it's such a long road and it's such a hot day. Would you mind if I rode on your horns for a way?" "Of course not," smiled Thidwick, the big-hearted moose. "I'm happy my antlers can be of some use. There's room there to spare, and I'm happy to share. Be my guest, and I hope that you're comfortable there." So the binglebug picked out a nice, easy seat, and the moose went on looking for moose moss to eat. Well, an hour or so later, the bug heard a squeak, and he heard the small voice of a tree spider speak. "I say," said the spider, "you've got a fine place. That moose seems quite friendly, is such a nice face, and if I got on too, do you think he would mind?" "Hop aboard," laughed the bug. "I think that you'll find that the moose won't object. He's the big-hearted kind." "I accept," said the spider with joy and delight, and he started a web on the horn to the right. While the spider was spinning, he heard a gay song, and a fresh little zinazoo bird came along. He stopped, and he stared, and he chirped, "Well, well, well, what a smart place to live. What a swell place to dwell. I've been living in trees ever since I was born. But here's something new. Why not live on a horn? If there's room there for two, then there's room there for three. There's plenty of room," laughed the bug, "and it's free." Thidwick stopped walking. What was all this talking? Those guests had caught Thidwick the moose unawares. "Hey!" he called. "What goes on there upstairs?" "Just building a nest, sir," the zinazoo said, and began yanking hairs out of poor Thidwick's head, and he plucked out exactly 204. "Don't worry," he laughed, "you can always grow more." And he dozed off to sleep in his fine moose hair nest. "This bird," murmured Thidwick, "is sort of a pest. But I'm a good sport, so I'll just let him rest, for a host, above all, must be nice to his guest. Besides now, it's getting quite late in the day, and surely tomorrow they'll all go away." But alas, the next morning the sun's early light brought to Thidwick's sad eyes a most unwelcome sight. "Meet my wife," said the bird. "I was married last night. And perhaps, by the way, I should mention to you that her uncle is coming to live with us too. You're a very fine host, so I knew you'd be willing." Then Uncle, a woodpecker, started in, drilling. All Thidwick's friends shouted, "Get rid of those pests!" "I would, but I can't," sobbed poor Thidwick. "They're guests." "Guests, indeed," his friends answered. All of them frowned. If those are your guests, we don't want you around. You can't stay with us, 'cause you're not of our sort. And they all turned their backs and walked off with a snort. Now the big friendless moose walked alone and forlorn, with 4 great big woodpecker holes in his horn. "What holes?" whispered Herman, a squirrel, who spied him. "What holes to hide nuts in?" Mind if I try 'em?" "They're yours," said the woodpecker. "Get right inside 'em. This big-hearted moose runs a public hotel. Bring your nuts, bring your wife, bring your children as well." So the whole squirrel family all jumped on, pell-mell. And the very next thing the poor animal knew, a bobcat and turtle were living there too. Now what was the big-hearted moose to do? Well, what would you do if it happened to you? You couldn't say scat, because that wouldn't be right. You couldn't say scram, because that isn't polite. A host has to put up with all kinds of pests, for a host, above all, must be kind to his guests. So you'd try hard to smile, you'd try to look sweet, and you'd go right on looking for moose moss to eat. For now it was winter, and that wasn't easy. For moose moss gets scarce when the weather gets freezy. The food was soon gone on the cold northern shore of Lake Winnebago. There just was no more. And all Thidwick's friends swam away in a bunch to the south of the lake where there's moose moss to munch. He watched the herd leaving, and then Thidwick knew that he'd starve if he stayed here. He'd have to go too. He stepped in the water, then, oh, what a fuss. "Stop!" screamed his guests. "You can't do this to us. These horns are our home, and you have no right to take our home to the far distant side of the lake." "Be fair," Thidwick begged, with a lump in his throat. "We're fair," said the bug. "We'll decide this by vote. All those in favor of going say aye. All those in favor of staying say nay." "Aye," shouted Thidwick. But when he was done, "Nay," they all yelled, and he lost 11-1. "We win," screamed the guests, "by a very large score." And poor starving Thidwick climbed back on the shore. Then you know what those pests did? They invited some more. They asked in a fox, who jumped in from the trees. They asked in some mice, and they asked in some fleas. They asked a big bear, and then, if you please, came a swarm of 362 bees. Then Thidwick sank down with a groan to his knees, and then he heard something that made his heart freeze. Bullets came zinging right past Thidwick's face. Guns were bing-banging all over the place. "Get that moose! Get that moose!" Thidwick heard a voice call. "Fire again and again, and shoot straight, one and all. We must get his head for the Harvard Club wall." Thidwick took to his heels with that load on his head. With 500 pounds on his horn, the moose fled. He could have run faster without all those pests, but a host above all must be kind to his guests. Up canyon, up cliff, or wild rocky trail, with bullets bouncing around him like hail, up gully, through gulch, through slippery sluice. With hard-hearted guests raced the poor moose. Then finally they had him. Because of those pests, he'd run out of luck. Because of those guests on his horns, he was stuck. He gasped, he felt faint, and the whole world grew fuzzy. Thidwick was finished completely. Or was he? Finished? Not Thidwick. Decidedly not. It's true, he was in a most terrible spot. But now he remembered a thing he'd forgot. A wonderful something that happens each year to the horns of all moose and the horns of all deer. Today was the day, Thidwick happened to know, that old horns come off so that new ones can grow. And he called to the pests on his horns as he threw 'em. "You wanted my horns, now you're quite welcome to 'em. Keep 'em, they're yours. As for me, I shall take myself to the far distant side of the lake." He swam Winnebago and fouled his old bunch, and arrived just in time for a wonderful lunch at the south of the lake where there's moose moss to munch. His horns, today, are where you knew they would be. His guests are still on him, all stuffed as they should be. The end. Thidwick, the moose. All right. Did you like that story? I love that story.